Welcome, everyone. Good morning. We're here for Leading Ladies today, another conversation in construction. We're just going to take a couple minutes while everyone is joining the webinar. I'll go through a little USGBC LA introduction, and then we will get on to the main event. So just give everybody another minute or so. Okay, well, they're coming in. I will just give a quick overview. Welcome. My name is Becky from USGBC LA. We are so happy to have you join us. This is our final webinar of 2020. We've put forward so much virtual green content this year, and we're so happy that you've been along for the ride with us. So welcome to this episode of Leading Ladies, episode 4, If You Build It, They Will Come. For those of you who don't know about USGBC LA, we are an independent nonprofit focused on everything from green buildings to building a more sustainable community in LA as a whole. And I'll just let you know a few different opportunities to get involved with us this year and beyond. Like I mentioned, we did a lot of virtual content in 2020, and we are already starting to load our calendar for 2021. We're streamlining things a bit, so you can expect a webinar from us every single Wednesday. It'll be a webinar Wednesday. The timing will shift, but that is the day we will be doing all of that type of content. Our events will take place on Thursdays, and then our trainings will be on Fridays, giving everybody a really great cadence to know what's going on with us. So our first few webinars, events, and trainings are all scheduled for the week of January 13th. So please check those out. A lot of good things coming. And then our first quarterly thought leadership event will be in February, focused on talent. So it will be a virtual job fair talent combo mini conference. So it will be very cool. And I invite you to check that out. And there's a plethora of other ways that you can find out what we're doing and get involved. Everything is on our talent portal. So welcome you to check that out on our website or join one of our wonderful committees focusing on everything from corporate sustainability, building decarb, and beyond. So there's really something for every professional and personal interest. And it's a really great way to start getting involved with the chapter. We also have programs like the Healthy Building Alliance, which is a pledge to keep indoor spaces healthy for occupants. So it's not just about how you build the building, it's how you maintain it once it is built. And this is more of a pledge that building owners can take. And we're also rolling something out in 2021 about your home office. So ways to green and make your home office healthy, since we're all spending a lot more time in our home offices and much less in our shared offices. And we are a small nonprofit team. So if you do like the content we're doing, always got to throw that out there. We have a text to donate, and we so appreciate you if you are able to do that before the end of this year. And then, of course, thank you so much to our sponsors. These are the ones that keep this going all year round and really support what we do. And we couldn't do it without them. And of course, we couldn't do it without our community. So thank you for joining us today and being a part of that community. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer and Kathleen to get us going for Leading Ladies episode 4.
Hello, everyone. Becky, do I have my screen shared now?
You don't yet. You're going to have to just reshare that window.
Okay. I think it's here. Make sure that I'm right. Am I right?
Perfect.
All right. Yeah. Well, hello, everyone. We're coming fast to the end of this year that I'm sure everyone is ready to put to bed. I am Kathleen Smith, and joining me today is my colleague, Jennifer Tung. We are both attorneys at the law firm of Hunt Ortman. We have been engaged with the Leading Ladies for the past year, and this is our 4th installment of the Leading Ladies. And so hopefully some of you out there are return visitors, that we haven't scared everyone off with the disaster talk that lawyers usually have. But we wanted to end the year on what we consider to be a somewhat upbeat note, because we've got this this combination, this program that's being enrolled. And Jennifer and I thought that this was a really good way to end the year on a note of hope, on a note of progress, and a way that we're using our industry to not only do good for our community, but for the environment as well, and the ways in which those are not mutually exclusive goals. So while we can't take credit for this, we do want to be guides as we walk through this process, because as Jennifer will in quick order let you know, is that this is something that's really developing, and it would be amazing to send this program off, or push this program off, in the best way possible. And so to that end, we want to bring some of our understanding of what the program has to offer, and some of the legal complications that, as green builders and persons within the construction industry, obviously you want to have a full view. But that we really are optimistic and hopeful that this program is going to be, something that we see more of in the future, and that really can get us out of the doldrums that 2020 has, really kind of laid on thick. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
All right, good morning, everyone. And Kathleen, thank you for the great intro. As everyone knows, there are often headlines about affordable housing, especially here in LA, and specifically the lack of it. Certainly, anecdotally, I've been seeing more news about it this last year. The issue has been exacerbated by the economic impacts of the pandemic that we've been facing this year. And so one of the pressing public policy issues to address in LA specifically is this affordable housing issue. The other sort of topic du jour that we often hear or see about in LA is clean energy. So here you just see some of the sample headlines that we often see in LA about affordable housing. Energy efficiency. California, as we all know, is a gold standard state in the US, often spearheading clean energy and global warming initiatives. So these two public policy issues are often treated as separate worlds. They're often addressed, with separate legislative measures, separate local measures, but these things are more intertwined than I think they appear at first glance. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about a program that's been acronymed BUILD. It seeks to at least start to chip away at these two issues of affordable housing and sustainability here in California. So it's first started with SB 1477, which was signed into law back in 2018. And what this did was it authorized two different programs to be established. One, which has been acronymed TECH, standing for Technology and Equipment for Clean Heating. And the other one is the one that we're going to be focusing on today, which is BUILD, which stands for Building Initiative for Low Emissions Development. So as a quick overview as to what SB 1477 does, is it requires the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utility Commission to work together to develop and administer this program that would focus on and help incentivize the use of near zero emissions heating technologies for new homes. And it would be funded through incentives provided by the gas company. And the funding comes from reserves and money generated from cap and trade allowance auctions. So, so that's generally what SB 1477 does. Once it got signed into law, it did get codified into our state statute. So you can find the official language about the build program in Public Utility Code 921 and 921.1. Colloquially, we all often talk about these landmark goals like, AB 32, here SB 1477. But I think it bears reminding everybody that, that these things do get codified into state statute once they get passed into law. So the other thing, other items that Build does is it does focus not just on new housing, but specifically on new low-income housing. They really want to address sustainability and lowering emissions for our low-income communities. Build also establishes that the CEC and CPUC will determine what new heating technologies will be eligible for participation in this build program. And the build program, as we'll talk about more later, is a pilot program. And so it does also authorize program administrators to figure out metrics by which to measure how well this program is working, how well it's being administered.
So as Jennifer indicated, this is a pilot program, and with all pilot programs, there comes, some need to put together a plan for the implementation. And since about January of 2019, the CEC and the CPUC have been reviewing what this program, not just taking the goals, but making the goals something that is, sustainable, and that it promotes the goals, that we're getting participation at the right levels for this particular project. The CEC has been authorized and is the program administrator for the build program, subject to CPUC approval. But the CEC has been tasked with developing all of the guidelines and the program details. And in September of 2020, the CEC published its most recent draft of its proposed implementation plan. And I say proposed, and you're going to hear a lot of hedging as we go into the details of the implementation plan, as well as the eligibility requirements that are contained within it. Mostly because this is something that is maybe not a completely new road that we're going down, but that there are a lot of stakeholders and a lot of different interests that are trying to be balanced in connection with the unveiling of this program. And as such, the CEC is doing a lot of review and analysis of how best to implement the build program. So in September of 2020, they rolled out the most recent version. It is a revised version, but it takes into consideration some of the feedback that they were getting from their stakeholders. So jumping ahead, one of the major aims of the program and the implementation portion of the program is to make sure that obviously the goals of the build program are being satisfied, but that there's also a real identifier that we don't want to make the requirements and the processes that would be used by a developer or an owner to take advantage of these incentives, that it's so onerous that it disincentivizes their use of our program. In addition, there's also a recognition that California, as the gold standard, has a lot of other complementary programs in place. And so as this program is being really fleshed out, the CEC wants to make sure that these are complementary programs and that we are not doing something in one area that is somehow making a builder developer ineligible for other types of assistance programs that already exist. So what does the implementation plan really contain? Well, obviously it's going to have guidance on the eligibility of a particular program to take advantage of the incentives that the build program has in place. There's also a lot of discussion about what the incentive structure really includes. And there is a lot of development within that right now about, not only just baseline incentives, but then also potential incentivizer kicker incentives that, certain projects could obtain in the event that they go above and beyond the basic minimum requirements that are being set forth in the build program. In addition, there has to be some, true and clear guidance to any of the applicants about what it's going to take in order to become eligible for these incentive programs. And especially when you're dealing with low income components of this program, there's a very clear awareness by the CEC that a lot of the times funding sources need to be identified very early on in the development process. So there is an eye to making sure that whatever is identified and rolled out as the actual regulation in order to apply for the build program incentives is not going to conflict with any other obligations that a developer would have in connection with, other tax credits or incentive plans that they may otherwise be eligible for. There's also an investigation and an analysis of eligible equipments and new technologies that are going to be incorporated within the build program. As we'll discuss in a little greater detail in just a minute, there is a very real push right now that there's going to be predetermined rates for the incentives. And so by virtue of that, the CEC has looked and seen what we need to do in order to make that achievable. And one of the ways in which they're making that, the certainty of what rates you can anticipate receiving from the build program, they're setting these things in the very beginning. So any kind of eligible equipment or new technology needs to be evaluated at the front end to ensure that it actually is something that the CEC is going to ultimately end up giving developers and owners the incentive rates back for the use within these buildings. In addition, one of the kind of inventive and really kind of interesting components of the build program is that there's also going to be a technical assistance component to it, which is having the CEC provide design assistance for developers who have programs and projects that are eligible for this program. So there's got to be a weighing of what kind of information, what kind of assistance is going to be given as part of the process. And again, transparency at the very early stages to show anyone that their efforts in trying to make these changes to their design are going to ultimately be fruitful for them, because there is an awareness that some of these new technologies, new equipment, and requirements are going to cost builders more money in the long run without these incentives. So we've got all of these things that are, in the percolator, but we have to wait. Right now, it's looking like 2021 is going to be the year in which the implementation guidelines are finalized. So, despite the fact that the CEC has actually hit some really impressive deadlines. I mean, they began review of this program in January of 2019, and they're already through at least their second version of the implementation guidelines. They anticipate that there's going to be additional information available in the first part of 2021. And, all things, going the way that we want, the hope and the expectation is that by the second quarter, maybe the third quarter of 2021, we're actually going to see not just the finalization of the implementation guidelines, but actually seeing the first round of applications be submitted and reviewed and have that process already moving forward so that by the end of 2021, hopefully we find ourselves in a in a better place than we are right now.
And that's right. Just the build is just one more thing that we are all looking forward to in 2021, and another reason to look forward to putting 2020 well behind us. We touched a little bit on kind of how much money is allocated to this program. So the law that established this program allocates $50 million a year over the course of 4 years, so a total of $200 million for both the build program and also the tech program. Out of the $200 million, the Public Utility Commission has determined that $80 million of those dollars are going to go to build. And essentially, the reasoning behind that is because build focuses on new housing exclusively, whereas the tech incentives will go towards both new buildings, but also retrofitting existing ones. And it's typically less expensive to incorporate newer, lower emission technologies in brand new homes versus retrofitting existing buildings. And so because of that, tech gets a little bit more money than build does. So the other thing I wanted to mention quickly about the initial budget is that of the $80 million that is allocated for build, 60 million of that, so 2/3 of that is earmarked for direct incentives towards low-income projects. And then the other third will go towards things like paying for outreach and technical assistance and administrative costs. So it is commendable that at least as of right now, the funding is designed to have most of it go directly towards builders and developers to incentivize their projects.
We also wanted to let you all know that, the budget is being funded with this $50 million per year for 4 years. But that is not the time in which these monies need to be spent, is that there's actually an already identified time term out, which is 10 years to use the funds. So of the $80 million that's being allocated for build, that $80 million does not need to be spent by the end of the fiscal year 2023. Instead, it needs to be completely used by July 1st, 2033. Otherwise, any unused portion of the amounts that were funded for the build program will actually be returned to ratepayers.
And that's right. And that's good to keep in mind because that way, builders and owners don't feel like they're in a hurry to actually complete their projects by 2023, especially since, the CEC and CPUC haven't even opened up the application process yet. So, they, like Kathleen said, the money is going to be allocated over the course of 4 years for the program, but the program does have essentially 10 years to actually divvy it out to builders. Okay, so how do you actually qualify to participate in this project or in this program? So here are some of the basic eligibility requirements. You must be an owner or builder to apply. Consultants working on owner or builder developers' behalf can also apply for them. It has to be for new residential housing. And because this is a law, everything has its own special definition, and you can't just go with like normal people understandings of what residential housing is. And so what does new residential housing mean? It means a building that has never been used or occupied for any purpose. It can also mean a building that has been added to or remodeled, where at least 50% of the weight-bearing walls are demolished. It can also mean an existing building that was not previously used for housing, but now is being converted to housing. So any of those things qualify your project as a new residential house to make you eligible for build. Some of the other requirements are that your new residential housing has to be all electric. So 0 gas hookups planned. If you are converting an existing building into for housing and it qualifies under the residential housing definition, then you have to show the build administrators that all gas hookups are disabled. So I know a few people are crying over SoCalGas going perhaps the way of the dinosaur, but essentially what that means is that the gas companies are providing incentives for projects that will ultimately help phase them out. So all electric, new residential. It also has to be for low income housing. And low income is another one of those things that has many very technical legal definitions. For build, low housing can mean where at least 2 rental housing units in a building are referred to as deed restricted low income housing. So they were purchased with the help of either government or nonprofit subsidies. And that the building is located in a, quote, disadvantaged community, and disadvantaged community has a statutory definition. It is one located in an area that is disproportionately affected by environmental pollution or other hazards. So this is another thing that I think the CEC should be commended on. Its attempt at, at least touching on environmental justice issues, which I think can often be kind of a third rail in sort of sustainability efforts, at least from a government perspective. And then if your project is in a, quote, low-income community, that also qualifies. Low-income community is defined as an area in which 50% of households have an income of less than 60% of the area median gross income. And then finally, the other definition of low-income housing is at least 80% of the households living in the building have incomes at or below 60% of the area median income. So lots of fun, thorny statutory definitions that you're going to have to kind of check off your list to qualify as low income. The other requirement is that your project has to be in an eligible service territory. So Kathleen touched on this earlier, that the funding is going to be both coming from proceeds derived from greenhouse gas allowance auctions. And so they're also going to be so gas companies pay for those, right, when they buy their greenhouse gas emission allowances. They're also going to be doling these incentives out. And so the program wants to make sure that your gas company pays for the projects happening in its own territory.
So we've talked about the eligibility, and now let's talk a little bit about what the proposed incentive structure is going to look like. One of the main goals that the CEC is attempting to achieve in connection with developing its incentive structure is making sure that it's doing something that's flexible, that accounts for the various different components that are being addressed within the build program. So the incentive structure needs to account for the participation rates. It needs to account for market activity, costs, complementary programs that serve at least a portion of the stakeholders being identified within the build program, greenhouse gas savings, impacts on the grid, locations, everything like that, just kind of all into one. And, it's a mouthful to say all of the factors that they are, trying to address when structuring how to fund these projects and incentivize this low income and energy efficient building. So what they are tasked with, what the CEC is tasked with, is developing a system and an incentive structure that is consistent so that it can be standardized and applied across all projects without having to do any kind of weighing and scoring. But that also is tying to the innovation that we've seen within the green markets and making sure that we're accounting for the increased cost of equipment, incremental differences of cost to builders who are electing to move forward on a green building platform as opposed to a traditional building platform. Making evaluations and quantifying the evaluation criteria for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and making sure that whatever incentive structure is set out really does prioritize the use of these funds for not just low income housing, but in the event that there is additional available funds for what is being considered what they call a mixed market housing, where maybe not 100% of all of the units are rented out to those with low income or who qualify as low income. And then, of course, we have an ever-changing and evolving energy code. And so the considerations for the CEC are that they want to ensure that whatever eligibility requirements and incentive packages that they put together not only are changing and being modified in lockstep with the building codes, but that they're actually asking for a little bit more. So that any of the developers who have projects that are approved for the build incentive funds are, by virtue of meeting the build standards, will inevitably be achieving all of the energy standards that are set forward in the regular building code. So you essentially get a twofer when you build to the build guidelines. So where we are with that is that there's going to be an evaluation of the whole building, the whole structure performance. And there are many components that go in with that. But at least for right now, what the CEC is proposing is that there is a predetermined rate of funding for each climate zone and building type. And that it's going to be based in part on the expected annual greenhouse gas emissions that are avoided by using these technologies and this equipment within these structures. They're going to be looking at offsets for equipment. They're going to be looking at, the cost differentials that builders will be facing, again, as compared to traditional building. And they really do want to reflect, the benefit of the reduction of the greenhouse gas levels with the use of these technologies and equipment. And even though there is going to be an assessment almost at a per bedroom per unit rate, the ultimate goal is that when you look at the project as a whole, the whole of the project is performing. And there are, again, lots of branches and tentacles that run off of that, simply because, especially when you're dealing with multifamily units, there is a lot of differentiation of how you figure out these things between common spaces and, individually owned or occupied spaces. And while a predominant goal within the build is to make sure that we have this reduction of greenhouse gas emission, equally important is that this is truly affordable. So beyond just identifying the projects as being, earmarked for low income housing, they want to make sure that there isn't an end user tax, essentially, so that these low income occupants would then rent these spaces and then have costs of living that were not otherwise that weren't otherwise there. So a a very large component of the incentive structure that the CEC is currently developing is ensuring that they have good analysis of how to evaluate and quantify whether or not there is an increase in utility bill to the end user of these projects. And there's a big push to make sure that what we're not having is that builders are taking these incentive packages and then passing down the costs of these buildings to, again, the ultimate occupant of the property. So the CEC is going through great lengths of evaluating what is the baseline for evaluating whether or not utility bills are more or at least at the same level as could otherwise be expected under, again, traditional building. In addition, we've talked about this a little bit before, is that that part of the process here is to make sure that the program is flexible and it moves as the whole program moves. The CEC and the CPUC are very aware that that there really are some things that are better put at the front end, and to that end, instead of having evaluated criteria where any particular project is going to receive a score, we wanted to avoid it. They wanted to avoid that, and instead essentially say, hey, listen, anyone who can satisfy these requirements, you're going to have access to these funds. So the prescriptive template is more or less, a pathway, a guide to being able to have access to these funds. And while having access to the funds is critically important, so is knowing what your rate of funding will be. Talked about this a little bit earlier, is that there's a keen awareness that, especially when you're dealing with low income projects, that there are requirements under other systems and other comparable programs that require builders to have the funding in place in advance. And anyone who is undertaking this type of project is well aware that having an understanding of what your ultimate project costs are going to be is a critical component to whether or not this is a feasible project or not. So with that in mind, the CEC has made, at least initially, the determination that there is going to be a particular rate for each piece of equipment, eligible equipment or eligible technology, so that when a developer is looking over this program to see whether or not it is worthwhile to go through the additional administrative process, they can actually quantify where they believe they will land when their design is finalized. That they'll actually have a dollar figure that they can, rely on when putting together their pro formas and making sure that they have a project that pencils out. So again, we keep on talking about that these are proposals, and I know that it's an exciting time to be in this industry and to see the way in which we have these dual policies that are coming together to do or make a real big difference for Californians. But unfortunately, we still are kind of waiting on the finer details. So what are we looking at, what that process is going to be? Well, the CEC knows that it's very important that in order to get the right kind of participation, there's going to have to be education that is unveiled. And just like we're doing today, that there's a walkthrough, not only the eligibility of the project, but also of what the expected goals are going to be and what the risks and responsibilities are going to be for the program participants. But equally important is the educational process to the end users of these buildings. So there's a real effort to go out and educate the population so that they know what is happening, when this will be useful for your project and whether or not it's coming to a community near you. In addition, as we move through. The CEC is also going to be providing technical assistance for its potential developers. And one of the really kind of cool features of this is that you essentially get someone who is familiar with the eligibility requirements and the regulations that are being issued and approved, that will help with the design process. That is not a cost to the developer. So there's a design assist component to this, that will be very, helpful, because the CEC does want to make sure that there is an influence on the design component of these projects, that we don't want to simply be in a position of evaluating a design once it's all said and done, but we do really want to be pushing out and forward in front of these things and start making people think more about the way in which their project could either, have additional greenhouse gas emission reductions, or whether or not they're willing to take that step into the all electric field. So again, we've got our outreach component. Now we've got some design assistance from some technicians who would be supplied by the CEC. Then you've got your application process, which, even if it wasn't a pandemic, within this industry, I think that the online application would be a good thing. Hopefully they will have some parameters in place that you can actually track your application as it moves through the process. And then you have your ultimate review and approval. That gets you, essentially to the starting gate. But then, obviously, if you've been approved for, a certain percentage or a certain dollar figure, as a developer, you're going to want to make sure that you actually receive those funds, because that's going to be a critical component to the success of your project. Currently, the payment, the funding mechanism is under review. But the proposed funding mechanism is that the reimbursements that a builder would receive would come in 3 installments. It would come in an installment of 25%, and then a second installment at the 50% of the total value of the incentive that a project was approved. And then at project completion, an approved developer owner would receive the final installment reimbursement of the last 25% at the project completion. So essentially right now we've got 3 predominant milestones that would trigger reimbursement obligations by the CEC. But that is still somewhat under review. And obviously, in part, it's under review because of the fact that project participants are going to be having to front those funds in advance of actually receiving a reimbursement from the CEC, instead of it being something that was, a credit that was given.
Okay, so like we've mentioned, there are no final guidelines yet. There's no final application process yet. So we wanted to just highlight some things for you to be on the lookout for, both in terms of in the next round of guidelines or implementation plans being issued, but also to keep an eye out for when you're actually on your projects. For example, timing issues. Their build applications aren't open yet. So you definitely want to pay attention for, when the next implementation plan is being released, when applications are opening up. Projects, there are other government programs or tax incentives that are funneled towards low income construction projects, and those have their own deadlines also. And so you want to be mindful of how those deadlines harmonize or not with whatever build deadlines get put out for, when you submit your invoice and when you expect your payment. And then there are also just the typical construction deadlines that everyone is up against when you are actually working on your projects. And so if you are anticipating funds from build, then there's just another set of funding deadlines that you'll have to be mindful of, that will then that may or may not impact funding and construction timelines on your actual projects. So those are a couple of timing issues to be mindful of moving forward.
Right. And then to pick up on where I more or less left off on the last slide is that based on the current proposals, this is going to be a reimbursement system as opposed to there being a check handed over to the project owner. So with that, obviously you have to be made aware of the fact that there is going to be certain milestones and that you're not going to have access to the funding until you have achieved a certain level. And that means that as a developer or owner, you're going to be on the hook for fronting those funds. And while I think everyone is very optimistic that this will move forward smoothly, I think that there also has to be on the project owner and developer end a mindfulness that there are likely going to be learning curve issues at the very beginning of the implementation of this program, and that if you were jumping on board 2 or 3 years down the road, some of those kinks would have been worked out. But I think that especially in those very first few projects, there's going to be some hard lessons learned in timing and process and procedure, and making sure that all of your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed. And then obviously that's going to have impacts on your project. Liquidity is always an issue on construction programs or projects. And so this program is no different. And if you are relying on the incentive funds, you do need to make sure that you have properly accounted for how to make payments until that time, and knowing that you may have to front load some of the other funding sources. And then obviously, as lawyers in particular, we always are looking at things like this, is that, what happens if there is some kind of breakdown in the project? And what kind of risks does a developer take by virtue of taking these incentives? Because there has not yet been a final decision made, but there is at least some indication that the CEC is considering potential clawbacks of funds that are provided. They have not really given a whole lot of guidance about whether or not that is only in play in the event that projects aren't completed, or if there is some kind of failure to achieve certain goals, or if the design that was proposed doesn't ultimately end up being the final as-built plan. So there's still a lot of room for mischief in the evaluation of what kind of consequence can result from the development as planned versus as built would necessarily have on the developer owner.
That's right. And, a lot of these issues that we talked about, involve kind of front end things, the application process, the construction process. But what about when your project is done? As Kathleen mentioned before, one of the requirements is that the occupants' utility bills aren't allowed to increase. But what happens if they do? As with anything, not just with new technology, sometimes there's a design issue, sometimes there is an installation issue, sometimes there is user error that results in fewer greenhouse gas emissions, or less utility bill reduction than was anticipated. So, if that were to happen, things to bear in mind are who is responsible for that. If the goal is to not flow down those increased costs to the occupants, is the owner going to be responsible? Is the builder going to be responsible? As Kathleen mentioned, the CEC is at least thinking about the potential for clawing back funds. Is that going to be on the table if it turns out that utility bills do increase, or if what was billed or what was initially evaluated to be a near zero emission technology ends up being less efficient in the real world versus during environmentally controlled test runs. Another thing to bear in mind is this reminds me of a case that came out of New York a few years ago, where a luxury condo was billed as being super green, super sustainable, super energy efficient, but in reality turned out to be much less than that. And so a group of the condo owners sued the developer for misrepresentation. And that case ultimately settled. But again, hate to always be the grim reaper and bearing, scary news, but just more things to kind of bear in mind and keep an eye out on moving forward.
Yeah. And for any of you that joined us for our presentation on consequential damages, this is essentially the intersection of those two episodes, because consequential damages in green building, really is a big deal. Obviously, because the ultimate goal is to achieve a certain energy efficiency or reduction of pollutants. And when you don't hit that, but you've incurred all of these additional costs in order to try and hit that mark, there is definitely not a whole lot of legal precedent that's on your side. So, it's definitely one of those areas that, potentially there is room for growth within the legal industry, but at least as things sit right now, consequential damages for failure to achieve certain energy or green building standards still remains a risk to a developer, owner, or purchaser of a property that was initially billed as being something that it didn't quite turn out to be. So we've thrown a lot at you, and it's a lot to take in, and I know that we don't have all the answers, but we would love to answer any questions that you may have about the program that may not have exactly made the cut in today's presentation.
So if there are no questions, though, or at least none that you can think of right now, always feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to provide you guidance where we can.
Thank you both so much. Oh, there's something in the chat. How big does the project have to be?
There is not necessarily a threshold for big or small. And that's a great question, because there is intentionally a lot of flexibility built into the program. And so we didn't really talk too much about it, but there has even been an idea about whether or not there would be a cap on the size for incentives per project. And at least right now, the CEC is suggesting that they do not want to cap a value of what a developer could receive in incentives. So it does not appear to me that there is going to be much in the way of setting a minimum value either. And I think that in part, just by the very nature of these types of projects, they don't often happen on a case-by-case basis, in the sense of like one single family home, but they could. And there's nothing that we have seen so far, and Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's nothing that I've seen so far that would set a minimum value on a project or the minimum size on a project for eligibility to this program.
And that's right. As of right now, at least, there doesn't appear to be a minimum or maximum project size or value, though the CEC is kicking around the idea of potentially limiting the number of projects that can qualify for the program from each developer or builder. They want as many builders and owners as possible to participate. And so even that's not yet finalized, but they are thinking about, an example that they gave was a 3-project cap for each owner or developer. And then if after like the initial 2 years where funds are allocated, there's money left, then they may lift that cap. So that's an idea that they're playing around with.
That was a great question.
That's it in the chat. Thank you both so much. This recording will also be up online for people that weren't able to view it, or if anybody wants to revisit the information, because there was a lot here. And thank you so much for sharing it. That just about does it for 2020, at least in terms of our content. I hope everybody has a really wonderful holiday time, stays safe, and takes a little bit of a break. Appreciate you all for being here, and we'll see you in 2021.
All right. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank
See
you.
you next year.